Professor Dakir, for your invitation and also for the introduction. I'm grateful to the Center, Ali Warraq Center for Islamic Studies, all the colleagues who have made this possible. There are a number of them. I understand that we were supposed to have had this event in a tent. It would have been a preferable place simply because the word Khayyam means tent maker, and he comes from a long line of tent makers. But as Omar Khayyam, often being a determinist, would say, it wasn't meant to be. So here we are. Most of the younger generation does not know who Omar Khayyam is. By some accounts, he has been more read than, well, after the Bible and Shakespeare, he's been more widely read in the West than any other author. If you were going to school in the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s, reading and memorizing quatrains of Omar Khayyam would have been part of your high school work. Those were the days when they did work in high schools. So what is the significance of Omar Khayyam? Who is he, and why should we study him in some depth? I'm going to talk about a few issues. First and foremost, why I became interested in spending several years doing research on him, why I wrote the book, and what are some of the issues and concerns that that intrigued me intellectually. And I'm not sure if I have resolved all the issues, but certainly I have pondered upon them for many, many years. First and foremost, Omar Khayyam was an 11th century mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, and a poet. His famous Rubaiyyat, or quatrains, were translated by Edward Fitzgerald in 19th century. Later on came to America and became very, very popular. I'll talk about that later on, but let me say a few words about the fundamental reasons for which I wrote this book. Not only he is almost a fellow, he's a fellow countryman, but I was born and raised about 2 hours from where the great master himself was born and raised. But there is something very, very unique about Omar Khayyam that you do not find among any other Muslim figure in the history of intellectual thought, perhaps with the exception of Abul Ala Ma'arri, who was an Arab poet. Several years ago, so if you grow up as an Iranian, poetry to you is like baseball to Americans. You can't avoid it. They make us read it, memorize it, and generally speaking, by the time you graduate, you have to have memorized at least 700-800 verses of poetry. And Omar Khayyam is one of the major figures whom we had to study and memorize. As a child, I remember going to his tomb with my parents, and they would be reciting his poetry loud. Even at that age, 5, 6, 7 years old, I remember the beauty and the simplicity of the Rubaiyyat, meaning quatrains, would leave an effect on me which were very, very different than reading Hafiz, Rumi, or any other poet. The style of his writings, when it comes to poetry, is uniquely quatrain, a particular type of quatrain that is his own. I wasn't quite sure why they were so powerful and what was the message. The message was very simple. It generally had something to say about the temporality of the world, about death, about suffering, issues that are pertaining, pertaining to everyday life. And so I grew up knowing Omar Khayyam as an agnostic poet, according to some, a hedonist, someone who had this sarcastic attitude towards religion at best. And so, according to others, it was all Sufi poetry. These were allegories, they were symbolism involved, and you really had to understand the symbolism to understand Omar Khayyam. A number of years ago, as part of the anthology that Dr. Daycake mentioned, I began to read his philosophical treatises. He has 6 very, very short philosophical treatises. And when I read them, an entirely different Omar Khayyam emerged. This Omar Khayyam was exactly a peripatetic, a Muslim peripatetic. That is, he wrote in the Aristotelian tradition. It was exactly as if you're reading Al-Farabi, Avicenna. He even had a treatise devoted entirely to proof for the existence of God. And so I came away from reading his philosophical poetry, his philosophical writings, 6 of them altogether, 5 of them in Arabic, 1 of them in Persian, with the impression that here is a Muslim philosopher speaking. And then you read his poetry, about 95% of them are in Persian, 5% of them are in Arabic, and there is the distinct impression that here is an Epicurean poet, someone who is dealing with existential issues, not so much the existence of God, but what kind of a God would allow so much suffering. What is the point of existence? If there is, I cannot rationally justify any. How can we account theodicy? Theodicy is a major, major theme in Omar Khayyam's poetry. If there is a good God, how can there be so much evil, and so on and so forth. And so there is a major discrepancy between his philosophical writings and his poetry. Now, there are endless discussions as to whether he is the author of all these poems. Anywhere from 12 quatrains to 1,200 quatrains have been attributed to him, and resolving this issue itself became an obsession with me, and I have offered a general formula to see if it works. So part of the reason for the writing and the research I did was precisely that, to see if we can make sense of basically someone who seems to have an intellectual schizophrenia, a Muslim philosopher and a hedonist, agnostic poet. Is there any way that we can bring about a rapprochement between these two? There are of course other issues, namely the authentic versus inauthentic poems and so on, but that was primarily what intrigued me the most. So what I'm going to do is to give you a very, very brief analysis of his, a brief biographical background as to who he was and so on and so forth. I won't spend much time on that, but you need to know something about that in order to be able to contextualize his poetry. My central thesis is that, and this, in my humble opinion, is a new reading of the quatrains, that once you contextualize it within the context of his time, his real motive for writing of these quatrains, or at least reciting them, we're not sure if he wrote it down or it was an oral tradition, emerges. But we shall deal with that later. Omar Khayyam was born in a very, very humble working class family. As I said, his father was a tent maker. He was born sometime around 439, 440 Islamic calendar. This is an 11th century figure. in the city of Neshabur. When he was 5 years old, he told his father that he is interested in going to school, to madrasa. And the father said, we are a humble family, I cannot afford to send you to school. And so the young Omar insisted, and the father finally took him to the imam of the mosque and told him that my son is interested in pursuing education. And the imam, who was somewhat sarcastic, told him, why don't you pursue the family profession and be a tent maker? What do you know about education and so on? And was trying to be dismissive of his interest. And Omar Khayyam said, ask me to read a verse from the Quran for you. Maulana Ghazi Muhammad, who was the imam of the mosque, said, you know the Quran? And he said, yes, I do. So, not believing the young boy, he said, well, recite a verse. To which Omar said, tell me which verse from which chapter you want me to recite. And still doubting the young 5-year-old boy, Imam said, read such and such a verse from a chapter which Omar recited. Apparently the Imam got dizzy. He had to sit down and said, who is this boy? Where have you come from? And how did you know this? Omar said, I have been going to the mosque along with my father, and as they have been reciting the Quran, I have been listening and I memorized it. He literally had a photographic mind, photographic memory, in several instances, one in Bukhara, one in Herat, and one in Isfahan. When he wanted to check out a book and copy it, it wouldn't allow him to do that, so he read it several times and then he dictated it to his students, and allegedly there were only a few words missing. So we're dealing with a very, very powerful intellect. He went from teacher to teacher. Generally speaking, every teacher lasted about 1.5 years to 2. And at the age 15, they said, go and tell your father to come. There is anyone in this area who can teach you. And Omar Khayyam himself became a teacher at the age 15, 16. It is said that there wasn't any book that he hadn't read by then. Omar Khayyam grows up. He takes several trips. He goes to the city of Ray. He is invited to go to Isfahan, which was the capital of the Seljuk Empire. There he benefits from the enormous libraries of the royal court. The Chamberlain, the Grand Vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, asks him to stay behind and become a member of the court philosophers. Omar Khayyam rejects that. He then is offered to be the governor of Khorasan, and he rejects that as well. He was smart enough to know not to become an administrator. You won't get much scholarship done. And so then he is asked to become the chief judge of Khorasan, and he rejects that on the ground that he would have to sentence people to harsh punishment, and he had no interest in that. So finally they asked him, what would you desire? And Omar Khayyam says, give me an orchard, apple orchard, near the city of Neshabur, where he was born, so I can spend the rest of my life in research. And that's exactly what happened. He settled in a village by the name Shadiyah, where he spent the latter part of his life in reading and writing. He trained very few students. He didn't like to have students, and there are some of his biographers said partially because he was a very austere man, a very grumpy old man. He wasn't a very patient man. Others have postulated other reasons. I happen to think the reason may have been safety, because if he were to tell his students what he really thought, he could get into trouble. I'm just curious, how many of you do know Persian? a few. The reason is so I read, to read the quatrains in Persian or not to read them is the question. So I'll read some of them. In one of his early poems, he says, "The secrets which my book of love has bred cannot be told for fear of loss of head. Since none is fit to learn or cares to know, it's better all my thoughts remain unsaid." So I think part of the reason for not wanting to be a public figure, he was somewhat of a mysterious figure, was probably because the content of his quatrains, as you will see, are very, very controversial. That's all I want to say about his life. He traveled several times. He was invited by several sultans and so on, but I like to use our time to focus on the more scholarly and academic side of his life. He wrote 12 books. 5 of them are of a scientific nature. They are in algebra, geometry, astronomy, and 6 of them are are of a philosophical nature. His philosophical works are primarily rationalistic, analytical, mashai, as we say, peripatetic, and then the 12th book is really not his. It's a book that is attributed to him, and it's full of errors, and but it's generally written about practices and rituals of the Zoroastrian people. We think that his father may have been a Zoroastrian, and that he grew up in a semi-Zoroastrian family, but we can't prove that. So, but he did study with Avicenna's best-known student, Bahmanyar, who himself was a Zoroastrian convert. So we also know about his interest in Zoroastrianism because when he was commissioned to design a new calendar, he kept the pre-Islamic names for the calendar rather than the Arabic names. It's the calendar which Iranians use as of today. Now, there are those who say nice things about Omar Khayyam, and there are those who say nasty things about him. Those who say, make positive comments about him primarily rely on the titles that were given to him. And these are very honorific titles like Hujjatul Islam, the proof of Islam, Siqatul Islam, Qiyasuddin, the nourisher of faith, and so on. In several conversations with people, he went into the intricacies of Islamic law, which indicates he was well versed in it, and the fact that he was asked to be the chief judge of Khorasan province means that he was well respected as a religious authority and a jurist. But he never wrote anything about it, and to the best of our knowledge, he didn't make any comments. In fact, he has a few sarcastic comments about jurists and Orthodox jurists, which I shall read. All right, let's move on and say a few words about the time in which Omar Khayyam lived. The time in which he lived was, in a sense, somewhat comparative and similar to, let's say, if you lived during the Taliban in Afghanistan, or if you lived in Iran. Omar Khayyam was well aware of the golden age of the Islamic history. The first several centuries, when Greek philosophy, Hellenic thought, rationalism, peripatetic philosophy was celebrated. Rationalism was a good thing, right? There was no limit. Not a single Muslim philosopher or scientist was persecuted for his belief. Someone like Khwarazmi not only postulated on the fact that the world Earth is of an spheric nature, but also calculated the radius of Earth, which came very, very close to the present one. And needless to say, what happened in Europe when someone suggested Earth might just not be flat. And so Omar Khayyam was well aware of it. But at the time when he lived, 11th century, late 11th century, all that had come to an end. Seljuks were Turks, and they were dominating, ruling in Iran. And when when a non-native dynasty wants to, when quote-unquote foreigners want to dominate an alien culture, you have to use two things. One is sheer power, and the second one is legitimacy. You need legitimacy. And the way Seljuks obtained the first one, they had big swords, so they knew how to use that. But the source of legitimacy came from the Orthodox jurists. And so Mu'tazilites, who were the Muslim rationalists, had lost the power struggle to the Ash'arites, the faith-based Orthodox theologians. Much of the early achievements of Muslim intellectuals, rationalists, was fading away. Philosophy had become a bad word. There were a number of philosophers who actually had to write a letter chastising Avicenna. They made up all sorts of stories. I'll just read a few of them. Ahmad ibn al-Hanbal issued a fatwa saying philosophers are heretics. Musa Nobakhti, who himself earlier on was an astronomer, issued a fatwa saying astronomy is a heretical subject. Even Ghazali, in the early part of his Ihya al-Ulum, revival of religious sciences, not issued a fatwa, but wrote extensively rejecting mathematics, geometry, and allowed arithmetic insofar as it is needed to figure out religious taxes. The rest of it is unnecessary. They even made hadith which are not true, one of which allegedly Prophet Muhammad said, in medicine there is no benefit, in geometry there is no truth, natural sciences are heretical, and believers in them shall burn in hell. So science was under attack, rationalism was under attack. The entire Islamic empire was engaged both internally and externally against the Crusades. And I often say that the crusade to the Islamic civilization was like 9/11 to American civilization. When 9/11 happened, all the fuzzy-headed intellectuals were pushed aside, and the generals and neoconservatives and all the people with big guns came to the forefront. And clearly, when a civilization is fighting for its survival, people who say, well, let's sit around and talk and have a discourse and debate and be civil about these things, doesn't work. The person I wrote my dissertation on, Sohrawardi, was one of those. He went to the court of Salahuddin Ayyubi's son, a Persian philosopher. His argument was that we all believe in one God, we all believe in one truth, so what's this fight all about? Let's talk. Well, they chopped off his head. So, Omar Khayyam knew very well what fate is waiting for him if he were to make the same argument. So that's primarily why he didn't write his poetry. We know about his poetry roughly about 80 years after. What is it that Omar Khayyam is trying to do? First and foremost, he tries to revive the spirit of rationalism in as much as he can. So he writes on geometry, he writes on arithmetic, he writes on algebra, on the mathematical side, right? And then philosophically, philosophy itself had become a bad word. Philosophers were regarded with suspicion. Philosophical discourse was somewhat of a heretical activity. And what does Omar Khayyam do? He writes philosophy. He writes it in a rationalistic manner. He writes in the Aristotelian tradition. He writes it in the tradition of the grand masters of the peripatetic tradition, and in fact was the last philosopher before a period known as the period of eclipse, which Islamic philosophical work, at least in the eastern part of the Islamic world, went into eclipse for several centuries. And so he tries to fight that on the religious ground, on the religious level dimension. He tries to do the best he can. And if you cannot criticize the fundamentalists directly out of the fear of death, what do? You do it indirectly. And you use other venues beside writing, perhaps oral tradition. And nothing is more powerful than poetry. And the shortest type of poetry is quatrains, right? That consists of 4 stanzas, 4 parts. Omar Khayyam, in a sense, one of the things I did was, so there are these hundreds of quatrains that addresses all sorts of issues. And was he just writing them willy-nilly? Was he writing them randomly? You read about the lack of certainty with regard to life after death. Then he goes into another subject. So I collected them, let's say, put them in one pile, categorized them. These are the ones he writes in that addresses the question of life after death. These are the ones that has to do with prohibition against drinking and so on. And then I collected lots of fatwas, religious edicts issued by Orthodox jurists, and sure enough, they seemed to match. That was the missing key. Omar Khayyam was, as an intellectual, was in a dialogue with the issues of his time. There were people who were issuing fatwas against geometry, against astronomy, against poetry, relying on the Quranic verse in which it chastises al-shu'ara, the poets, and so on. And so he was responding to them. Every single issue that was of great significance at the time to the intellectuals of the time, he was responding to them. And even though we don't have a great deal of time, but I'm going to read some of these. First and foremost, they accuse him of being a heretic for writing philosophy, and he goes to Mecca to prove that he is a good Muslim. And he writes the following quatrain to defend himself. A philosopher I am, opponents erroneously say. God knows I am not who they say. While I am in this sorrow-laden nest, I know not who and why I am, nor why I should stay. Right? دشمن به غلط گفت که من فلسفیم. ایزد داند که آنکه او گفت نیم. لیکن چو در این قماشیان آمده ام آخر کم از آن که من بدانم که کیم. Right? So this has to do with his defense of being a philosopher. He did not like the jurists. He did not like the Orthodox jurists at all. And so he, in one of his because they were issuing fatwas, issuing edicts, right and left, basically preventing free thinking, preventing creativity. And so he writes, "Oh, preacher." Preacher actually, I couldn't find a better equivalent for it. The real term is sahib fatwa, the one who issues fatwa. "O preacher, harder at work we are than you. Though drunken, we are more sober than you. The blood of grapes we drink, you that of men. Be fair, who is more bloodthirsty, we or you? Writing this in 11th century, at a time when the court was almost predominantly at the hands of Taliban mentality, is very, very brave. The Persian goes, ای صاحب فتوا ز تو پرکارتریم با این همه مستی ز تو هوشیارتریم ما خون رزان خوریم و تو خون کسان انصاف بده کدام خونخوارتریم. It's a beautiful, beautiful quatrain. Then we go to his specific charges against specific or his defense against orthodoxy, right? The quatrains, the Rubaiyyat, should be read within the context of, or should be read as a response to orthodoxy at the time. Omar Khayyam realizes that the golden age of Islamic history began when Muslims discovered Greek philosophy, Hellenic thought, sciences, Persian, Indian, Chinese, ideas from the school of Alexandria. There were no limits. And now all that is coming to an end. The only thing useful is pretty much Islamic law, jurisprudence, and that's about it. So comes the notion of certainty. You can only be certain with regard to matters of religion, and salvation lies in certainty. Omar Khayyam responds, ye do not grasp the truth, but still ye grope. Why waste then life and sit in doubtful hope? Be aware and hold forever holy name. From torpor sane or sought in death will slope. There are approximately a dozen poems in which Omar Khayyam rejects the idea that anyone can come to certainty with regard to religious matters. We shall remain in doubt forever, and we will deal with that a little bit more. So we start from the notion of impermanence. Then the symbol of potter, pot and potter, not the pot that is very popular in universities. We're talking about pottery, real pottery. Dust, dirt, is a very, very powerful symbol for Omar Khayyam. He says, I saw the potter in the market yesterday, pounding and pounding upon a fresh piece of clay. Behold, said the clay to the potter, treat me gently, for once like you, now I'm clay. The notion of impermanence play a major part in Khayyamian thought. We come from wherever we come, he says, we don't know, and we go to somewhere we don't know. The rest is purely speculation, right? And so against the very idea of certainty in life, certainty in matters of religion, certainty in faith, he has a lot to say. Then there is the concept of theodicy, right? If there is a good God out there, why are there so much evil in the world? How do you account for evil? By the way, since we had an earthquake a few weeks ago, Neshabur is on the fault line, and generally speaking, I remember even since childhood, every decade or so, we have a major earthquake of around 7 point something Richter scale. And so at the time of Omar Khayyam had seen major devastation of Neshabur and the surrounding. And so the theme of theodicy, or pain and evil, is a very, very major one that runs throughout his works. In what life yields in this two-door monastery, your share in the pain of heart and death will tarry. The one who does not bear a child is happy, and he not born of a mother merry. And then in a very, very daring quatrain, he says, life is dark and maze-like it is, suffering cast upon us and comfort in abyss. Praise the Lord for all the means of evil. Ask none other than he for malice. Right? So he's pointing the finger to none other than God himself for the source of evil. What kind of a Muslim would do that? No one. Right? And so does this partially account for why he didn't write them? Perhaps. How do we account for the fact that he actually writes a treatise entitled The Necessity for Contradiction and Evil in the Created Order, in which he philosophically defends the presence of evil as a natural byproduct of creation. His philosophical argument is God had two choices, not to create or to create. If God were not to create the world, that itself would have been an evil. But if he were to create the world, he couldn't have created it without evil. And so when you do a cost-benefit analysis between which one would be a greater evil, Omar Khayyam says, the evil of not creating far exceeds the evil of creation. Right? So there is the philosophical justification, logical justification, and yet there is, in poetry, that's one thing. If you have toothache, if you have a horrible headache, and somebody says, well, it's a natural byproduct of creation, that's not going to do much. There is pain, there is transcendental, and there is the immanent, right? So Omar Khayyam sees the world from two radically different perspectives. Philosophically, logically, yes, we can make sense of all the evil in the world. But when your child dies, when you lose a loved one, when you're in extreme pain, no logic is sufficient to respond to your condition. So my reading of it is that he is operating on two levels: the personal and the philosophical one. The frustrated voice of a human being who is suffering, who is seeing the suffering of people around him, is echoed in his poetry, and the more sober voice of Omar Khayyam is seen in his philosophical work. We have, we go to 2:45?
Yes, if you want to take some questions.
Okay, so I'll try to wrap this up within the next 10 minutes, and then we'll have a QA session. All right. Then there's the concept of doubt and bewilderment, which plays a very, very major role in Omar Khayyam's poetry. The sphere upon which mortals come and go has no end nor beginning that we know, and none there is to tell us in plain truth whence do we come and whither do we go. Doubt remains there. So as a person, right, we can offer all kinds of logical arguments for creation ex nihilo, why God created the world, and so on and so forth. But on an immediate level, it is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to find a logically defensible reason for human existence. And once again, the part that the thorny part of his ideas, the immediate one, the existential one, is echoed in poetry, whereas philosophically you can see his justification for the existence of the world. I have entitled this book "The Wine of Wisdom." Throughout the Rubaiyyat, you read about wine, women, lovemaking. It's all as I said, about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And one wonders how metaphorical this is and so on. Using the imagery of love, intoxication is of course nothing new in Sufi poetry, in Islamic mystical poetry. Just about every poet I know has used that. But Omar Khayyam uses it slightly differently. I don't think he went, after a day of writing mathematics or philosophy, he went home and got drunk. That, if he did, he did. But that's certainly not what is echoed in his poetry. What I think Omar Khayyam is doing by using the imagery of wine is what I entitled in vino veritas. In wine there is truth. There is this wisdom of a sage. There is this eternal wisdom, this wisdom that once you delve deeply into philosophy and theology and spend countless number of hours watching the celestial bodies, you arrive at a much deeper understanding of who we are, where we are, why we are. And this wisdom is what he uses metaphorically as a form of intoxication, right? The kind of pleasure Aristotle refers to as intellectual pleasure, as the highest form of pleasure, the pleasure that brings about forgetfulness of everything else and everyone else. Allegedly, someone comes to Omar Khayyam and asks him a grammatical philosophical question after the morning prayer, and he begins to give a discourse about this until the azan, the call for prayer, for noon prayer, is uttered, and the man says, "Thanks God for the azan, or else he would have gone on all day." So I think it's that kind of selflessness, that deep emotional, intellectual connection he has, which is symbolized in wine. I'll bring my brief remarks to an end by saying a few words about Omar Khayyam in the West. This is the most neglected area of scholarship. I planned on doing a fairly short chapter on Omar Khayyam in the West, but it ended up being the largest chapter because I kept discovering lots and lots of documents about that. Sir Ousley, a cousin of King George, who lost England, lost America, sent an emissary to Iran, who was a learned man, and after his return, he did what British often do, plundered the wealth of the libraries and brought a shipload of manuscripts, which he fortunately gave it to Bodleian Library in Oxford, and to be discovered a few decades later by a number of people, including the famous Fitzgerald, who translated the Rubaiyyat. He himself says this is not a translation, it's a rendition of the Rubaiyyat, but it is absolutely ingenious. If you have not read it, it's online. You should read it. The one single project Fitzgerald worked on all his life was translation and retranslation of the Rubaiyyat. Those were the days when people could concentrate, and so he came up with 5 versions of it. And soon after that, a number of people came to form a club in London called London Club of Omar Khayyam, and then it branched out in Germany, in France, in many countries, including United States. In early 1920s, Omar Khayyam Club of America was formed, and soon enough he became very popular, especially in New England area. people like Emerson, his father, his cousin, the chancellor of Harvard University, and a large group of people celebrated Omar Khayyam's poetry as the peak of humanism, a wisdom that the West needed. I'm not sure if their reading of Omar Khayyam was correct. In fact, I'm sure it was incorrect. But anyway, it was the Victorian Omar Khayyam which emerged, kind of a romantic figure, humanist, and so on. Omar Khayyam became very, very popular, and soon enough a group of poets began to name themselves Omarian Poets of America. And a particular literary genre developed in which a large number of American poets began to compose poetry in his style, and they had chapters from Texas to Ohio, from Georgetown to Boston, and gradually Omar Khayyam came to be known as not only a free thinker, but as champion of humanism in North America, in northern part of America. And as he went south, he was demonized, so much so that in the South, the Southern Baptist Church considered him to be the Antichrist, sent to pollute the purity of Christian faith, and they actually collected money to fight Omar's influence. And I've collected some of these in archives in Mississippi and so on. Hopefully someday I'll have the luxury of doing a book on Omar Khayyam in the West or in America. The story of Omar Khayyam, to summarize it, recapitulate on what I said, is basically an intellectual a philosopher, a theologian, a mathematician, a genius by any standard, who realized the value of rationalism, who opposed fundamentalist mindset, who did what he could to preserve the integrity of Islamic civilization and that which made it great. He could not do so, he failed, and his legacy was somewhat revived a few centuries later by other philosophers, but by and large, reading him would be a very, very good example of a person who has contemporary applications. If we need anyone in the contemporary world, it's a whole number of Omar Khayyams who can fight orthodoxy and the type of mindset which continues to plague the Islamic civilization.